Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. Junichiro Tanizaki is not my favorite Japanese author. That would be Yasunari Kawabata, of course. But he's an author whose novels and short stories always amaze me. I have read about a handful of his books, maybe 6 or 7 of them. And so far, based on my experience, I would say that the Makioka Sisters is his masterpiece. And I think that many critics and many readers also agree with me on that. I read it for the first time back in 2012, so it's been quite a long time. The other day I was thinking about that and I was like, wow, it's unbelievable that it's been so long. And a couple of months ago, maybe 3 months ago, when the summer break began, I was thinking of rereading this novel. I don't know why, but I felt this urge to re-experience this great text. And this is what happened to me. I went to the library as usual. That's most of what I do in the summer. And I saw this copy right there that they had on sale. It cost me $2. It's a hardcover copy from from Everyman's Library. Unfortunately, they didn't have the dust jacket there. But I was like, okay, I'm going to take this as a sign that this is a good time to re-experience the Makioka Sisters. So I bought it, even though I already had this paperback edition. But I always like to have a hardcover with some books, you know, so that I think at least it may last a little bit longer. So I love Tanizaki, but I also love Kon Ichikawa, one of the filmmakers who adapted the Makioka Sisters into film. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to look at the novel and also at the film and how, you know, the text translates from the page to the screen. For that reason, I need to tell you that there are going to be slight spoilers in this discussion. So let's begin with the written text, okay, with the novel, the Makioka Sisters. It was published in 1946, from 1946 to 1948. Okay, it was one of those serialized novels. And at 500 pages, this is really Tanizaki's longest text. It is a really good example, I would say, of modern realism. Okay, that's what I would call the mode here. The title in the original Japanese language is different from the one that we have in English. We know it as the Makioka Sisters, but the original title is Hosoyuki, which means light snow. Keep that in mind because that may have something to do with the protagonist of the novel, at least according to some critics, though I am going to offer a different interpretation of that. So at the center of the action, what we have is 4 sisters who live in Osaka when the novel begins. Then some of them are going to move, but at the beginning of the novel, that's what we have. And the 4 sisters are, the older one is Tsuruko, who is married to the head of the family, or at least the guy who became the head of the family when the sisters' father passed away. And Tsuruko's husband is called Tatsuo. Okay, so she is basically the one who is married to the head of the family, the most important sister. After her, we have Sachiko, and she is the one that the narrator focuses on. Okay, she's also married to a guy by the name of Teinosuke, but I'm going to tell you more about her in a few minutes. Then we have, of course, Yukiko, who is at the center of the conflict. She's becoming too old for marriage, so miai are arranged for her. And just in case you don't know, a miai is a Japanese word for just a matchmaking meeting in which 2 people meet with the, you know, the prospect of marriage and getting to know each other and all that kind of stuff. And then the 4th sister, last but not least, we have Taiko, who is also known as Koi-san, which means little daughter. Okay, she is the most impulsive, I would say, and she has really a disregard for tradition that also has to do with the central conflict of the novel. Question: what is the conflict here in the Makioka Sisters? Basically, we have this situation right here. Taiko, or Koi-san, wants to get involved with the man, but because there is a tradition in the family, she cannot get involved with the man until her sister Yukiko gets married. Okay, so she has to wait for all the others to be married, and Yukiko is not. So until Yukiko gets married, Taiko really cannot do anything. The problem here is that Yukiko has a tendency to reject her marriage proposals. That is the main conflict of the novel. And also, one of the problems that she has is that she has a mark above one of her eyes, and much is made of throughout the novel, regarding this mark that she has. So Taiko, in addition, had been in trouble before, because a few years before, she actually tried to elope with a man by the name of Okubata. Okay, she was involved with this man and they tried to elope. And to complicate things, the newspapers reported that it was Yukiko who tried to elope. There was a mistake right there. They mistook the sisters for each other. And, basically we have this whole problem right here between the two of them for the most part, but that affects the whole family. In a nutshell, what happens is that Taiko wants to get married, but she cannot because she has to wait until Yukiko gets married, and Yukiko has difficulty making up her mind. And to complicate all of that, as I said before, Yukiko's reputation has been affected by this negative action that Taiko took in the past. So that is the conflict, basically the way you look at it at first sight. But things are a little bit more complicated than that. Because you see, the Makioka family used to be great. It used to be a great family, but is now in the decline. Okay, so there's a clear sense of nostalgia throughout the novel because of that, because the characters are recalling the family's prosperous past. So you have the presence of the past, in the actual present, which is, as you know by now, one of my favorite topics in literature. So Yukiko and her family keep rejecting these marriage proposals for many different reasons that they give, but people are saying that it is because the Makioka family is living in the past. They do not want to accept the fact that they are not a great, prosperous, powerful family anymore. And that is, if you will, their tragic flaw as a family. So the main conflict here has to do with tradition. The question here that you may have, which is the one that I had as a reader, is why does the younger sister have to wait for the other sisters to get married? And there's really no reason. It's just a tradition, So what are you going to do? Are you going to follow tradition blindly and just accept it because it is a tradition, or are you going to try to go against it? Let me tell you a little bit about the themes here, and there are going to be many dichotomies in this novel that you're going to find. So that's one of the reasons why I like to look at the themes in terms of dichotomies, right? The first one, or one of the most obvious ones from the beginning, is the Osaka versus Tokyo dichotomy, okay? So at one point, Tsuruko, the oldest sister, is going to move to Tokyo, and that is going to, give you that contrast between Osaka and Tokyo. Another very important dichotomy is East versus West. Okay, this is also a concern that Tanizaki explored in Some Prefer Nettles, another great novel by him that I highly recommend, and is not at all as long as the Makioka Sisters. So that would actually be a very good place to start with Tanizaki. But in this other novel, right, in the Makioka Sisters, Tanizaki seems to have become, I don't want to say like, what's the word that I'm looking for? I want to say he has become a little bit reconciled with Westernization. He has come to accept it, okay, as something that is almost inevitable because of the world events that were going on at this time. Just to give you an example, one of the sisters, Yukiko, reads Anatole France and also the novel Rebecca. So you see this influence of art from the West in Japan. Wearing a kimono, for example, is taken as a sign of getting older. One of the characters comments that Taiko looks much better in Western clothes. And throughout the novel, you see a lot of comments to that effect that give you this contrast between East and West. Another very important dichotomy is family versus romance, right? What is stronger? Is a relationship, like a physical, romantic relationship, stronger than family ties? Is blood thicker than water and all that kind of stuff? So that's another thing that you can look out for. And then I left the best, or the most important, what I consider to be the most important, for last, because one very important dichotomy that you're going to find in the Makioka Sisters is tradition versus modernity. These two concepts are also related to Osaka versus Tokyo, because Osaka is more related with tradition and Tokyo represents modernity, right? Even though Osaka also includes, elements of both, but, just to give you a general idea of what I mean by that. But as I was reading the novel, there's something that I wanted to read you, because I was thinking of this idea, right? Tradition versus modernity. And I thought, and I remembered something that I had read in this book by Yasunari Kawabata, The Dancing Girl of Isu, and Other Stories. I read this ages ago, okay? I remember virtually nothing, but as I was reading the Makioka Sisters, I remembered one line, if you can believe me, okay, that I had encountered in this book many years ago that has to do with this topic. So I wanted to read it to you because I think it is related to what we are talking about. This is something that appears in the story A Prayer in the Mother Tongue. Okay, so if you have this edition of The Dancing Girl of Isu, it's on page 154. And here Kawabata says, "Humankind with its long history is by now a corpse bound to a tree with the ropes of convention. If the ropes were cut, the corpse would simply fall to the ground. So the ropes of convention, this idea of tradition, right? I think maybe the family's tragic flaw is an inability to find some sort of balance, right, between these two ideas, tradition and modernity. And by the way, that is a conflict that you find throughout Japanese literature, so I thought that was very important. And I also thought that Tanizaki would have agreed with what Kawabata was saying in this short story. At least, that's what I get from my reading of the Makioka Sisters. So continuing with themes, right, I would say that this novel, the Makioka Sisters, is an exploration of family dynamics at a time of big and important changes at the world level, right? Because unlike other novels, unlike other Japanese novels by Tanizaki and by other authors, this one portrays a Japan that is just unavoidably affected and aware of world events. Okay, we have two families here that are important, that live close to the Makiokas. We have the Stolz family from Germany and the Kirilenko family from Russia. Okay, you have to think that this novel takes place, the beginning of the novel at least, takes place in the late 1930s. So it's just unavoidable. Okay, the war is going on. This is going to affect the characters. And the presence of these two families, when we meet these families, the narrator can comment on the cultural differences between Europeans or Germans and Russians and the Japanese. For example, there is one chapter in which we get the contrast of how the Makiokas and how the Kirilenkos eat, okay, and how different their approach to eating is. So that's one thing that you can find there. And also, they have lots of conversations about politics and about current events. So that's another thing that you find that is unusual in Japanese novels, especially in this time period. A little bit about the structure. So the Makioka Sisters is divided into 3 parts, okay, and then those 3 parts in turn are divided into very brief chapters. The first part introduces the characters, that is typical in any novel, right? But we get a lot of psychological insight into these characters, especially into the 4 sisters. Each one of them is just clearly defined, as you're going to see. And of course, the first part also introduces us to the conflict, which is this idea that we need to get Yukiko married, and for some reason that is not happening, for one reason or another. Then we have the second part, which takes place 1 year later, okay, and the focus here is on a couple of natural disasters that take place both in Osaka and in Tokyo. So we have this sense of danger in this second part of the novel. Also, related to that in a way, Taiko meets another man, a guy by the name of Itakura, who is a photographer. And this really complicates matters, both for Taiko and for the entire family, because everything here is so connected, so tightly related. And then we have the third part of the novel, which is, I would say, more contemplative and also more melancholy. And in this part, what I see as emerging as a very important theme is the concept of sickness, okay, which is directly related to the decline of the family. The family in this part is really feeling the pressure to just marry Yukiko off. It seems that they would marry her to anybody, okay, just to get on with this process. And we also get a lot more insight into Taiko's personality. Taiko becomes a very complex character because there are many things that may be happening in her mind, right, and her motives maybe, they are complicated in this third part of the novel. So I really liked that I thought that I knew Taiko by the time that I got to the third part, and then I realized, there may be more to her than meets the eye. So it's very interesting in that sense. I wanted to put also this novel in the context of Tanizaki's work. Okay, I haven't read everything by Tanizaki, but I think I have a clear sense of what his work is like. And what I do is, and this may be a little bit simplistic, but when I read Tanizaki, I tend to divide his novels into 2 groups. On one hand, you have the subtle Tanizaki, and on the other one, you have the explicit or maybe even the shocking Tanizaki. So some prefer Nettles and the Makioka Sisters I would put in the more subtle category, and then on the other hand you have things like Naomi, like The Key, like Quicksand, like Diary of a Mad Old Man. Those would be the more explicit and the more shocking novels. So what stands out to me about the Makioka Sisters is just how detailed the novel is. Okay, we get lots of details. Just to give you an example, there's a part in which a miai doesn't happen and is postponed, right? And we get all the details, everything that happens to every one of the characters and why it was that this miai could not happen. And I was like, we don't need so much details, right? Why is the author? This is Tanizaki. If he's doing this, he's doing it for a reason. His other novels are not like that. They're pretty brief, actually. So I think what it does is to create a sort of heightened realism. That's how I would describe the realism of this novel, as a heightened realism. And what it conveys is a sense of frustration, of anxiety, of a sense of futility. Like this family is really, or seems to be, at a dead end. And that's what you get from this style in which the novel is written. Now, one question that I had and that I kind of suggested before is this: who is the protagonist of this novel? Okay. Now, one of the reasons why a sense of futility is evident in the Makioka Sisters is because the novel, if you ask me, focuses on Sachiko. Okay, she is a central figure right here, and I would go as far as to call her the protagonist. Now, I was mentioning the title before, Hosoyuki, and because of that Yuki in that title, many people say, okay, it is obvious that Yukiko is the protagonist. And I would say she is definitely the central character, the character that creates the conflict here and that produces the conflict. But I think if you read the novel, we really hear a lot more of the perspective of Sachiko than the perspective of any of the other sisters. So that's one of the reasons why I say that I believe that Sachiko is the protagonist here. She seems to be the one also who is most affected by the actions of the characters around her, right? So that to me is another mark of a protagonist. If you look at it this way, Tsuruko just seems to be above everything. Okay, she's the older sister. She's married to the head of the family. She has 6 kids. Okay, so she has plenty of stuff going on anyway. And then Yukiko and Taiko, the younger sisters, they're just causing trouble, right? They cause problems. On the one hand, Yukiko, through a lack of action, right, or an inability to act, and then on the other hand, Taiko, through selfish and just, irresponsible actions. Sachiko seems to be in the middle. She's the one who communicates all the trouble that Yukiko and Taiko are creating to Tsuruko. So she's the one who's trying to basically just hold things together, just keep this family from falling apart, as difficult as that is. Let's talk about the ending now, okay? So the novel comes to some sort of resolution, I would say, but it is far from ideal, this resolution that we get. I think that the thing that I like to think here is that the Makioka Sisters is a Japanese classic, but it is also a classic in the Western sense of the term. And by that I mean a classic a la Jane Austen or George Eliot or Gustave Flaubert, right? That kind of a classic. Now the ending is completely the opposite of the kind of ending that you would get from Jane Austen, for example. And if you want to know what I mean by that, I'm not going to reveal it, but just read that last sentence of the Makioka Sisters. You will know exactly what I mean. And if you have read the novel, I hope that you are smiling. The final events, when I was reading them, they reminded me of a film by Yasujiro Ozu. Not just one film, but I mean a film as in any film by him, because as you know, he tended to repeat the themes that he liked to talk about and to explore, which is, I think, is a wonderful thing. It's a mark of consistency in an artist. I thought, for example, of the relationship between the daughter and the father in Late Spring, right? That's just an example. But it wasn't Osu who adapted the Makioka Sisters, but Kon Ichikawa. So let's talk about him. We're going to focus on the movie now, okay? There are, at least that I know of, 3 adaptations of the Makioka Sisters into film. The first one is from 1950, and it stars Hideko Takamine as Taiko. So I thought that was interesting. Unfortunately, I have not been able to watch this movie. Then 9 years later, 1959, there was another version that stars Machiko Kyo. And then finally we have the Kon Ichikawa version, which is the one that you can see here. It's part of the Criterion collection, and that is the one that I would like to focus on. It's a movie from 1983, so you can tell that this is a late piece by Ichikawa. Okay, by this time he had already made his masterpieces, but I would say that this is still the Makioka Sisters by Ichikawa, an amazing work of art and just beautiful to look at. Okay, so it's by no means one of those cases where you say, okay, yeah, it's a good film, but it's not really that good. This is a very good film. I think it's an excellent work of art. Now, Ichikawa, as you may know, he was keen on adapting great works of literature. He basically adapted everybody, or most of the authors that are important from that time. He adapted Soseki, Kawabata, Mishima, his film version of The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, is just masterful. Okay, so Ishihara was another author that he adapted. His most famous film, I think, I believe, is The Burmese Harp, which is adapted from a novel by Michio Takeyama. So he even adapted Lady Murasaki, The Tale of Genji. So, you know, he was really good at this. And he had worked with Tanizaki's work previously because another, you know, his most famous films was The Key. It's not known as The Key in English. It is known as Odd Obsession. And it's a great adaptation of The Key, starring also Machiko Kyo. So I encourage you to watch that if you get the chance, because it's really a very good film. But talking about the Makioka Sisters, okay, if you look at the opening scene right there, this is an exposition scene, and I think it is very well done because we see the sisters in this first initial scene discussing their problem. Their problem is, of course, Yukiko, okay, or her inability to get married. And during this exposition scene, the focus is on faces. So we get really, really big close-ups, and that means that we are really going to get inside these characters. We are going to get into the minds of these sisters and into the heart of the problem that this family is experiencing. After that, the sisters go to see the cherry blossoms while the opening titles roll. So I really like this because the recurrence of this cherry blossom viewing is also present in the novel, and it is there to punctuate the action. It just marks the passing of time, and it gives you a really melancholy sense of the passing of time, because even just the image of, you know, cherry blossoms falling is just, to me at least, a very sad image. It's beautiful, but it's sad. And that is something important too if you look at it this way, because you have that Kawabata novel titled Beauty and Sadness. I think this combination of beauty and sadness is really Japanese in literature, in film, in art. So you have it right there, if that is one way that you want to look at it. Now, regarding shots, okay, when I was looking at the movie, I realized that the emphasis was, in this film at least, in interior shots. Okay, so there's an emphasis on that type of shot, and they are very interesting because they are not the typical interior shot. They're not the kind of interior shot that you get from Yasujiro Osu, okay? And here's the reason why I say they're different. These interior shots are oblique, okay? That's one way that I can describe it. So if you look at Yasujiro Osu, right, the interior shots are kind of straight. In this case, they are oblique. So you see the back walls and the rooms at an angle. And sometimes they are shown even from a high angle. So what this does, I think, is to give a sense that these rooms are really ample. So we see more empty space in the rooms than you would see in an Osu film. In an Osu film, the characters are there in the shot and they seem hardly able to move. It seems that if they moved, they would be out of the shot because everything is right there and there's not a lot of empty space. But here you get a lot more of that. And also regarding interiors, I saw something that you should look out for, which is an example of a westernized room. It looks like a French room. It's really nice. So look out for that. Let's talk a little bit about adaptation, since we are talking about Ichikawa. So this is a really cool topic to discuss. So as I said before, Ichikawa just embraced the challenge of adaptation because, let's face it, adaptation is really a challenge. And for the most part, if you look at his adaptations, there's not a lot of change going on here. Okay, the movies do not really feature big changes to the source material. That is something that Ichikawa is known for. In the case of the Makioka Sisters, what I thought was, when I was watching the movie at first, that there was a lot of dialogue that had to be added here, because the novel does not really include a tremendous amount of dialogue. There's quite a bit of dialogue there, but not too much. So that's one difference that you can find in the movie, that some things had to be put there in the dialogue so as to explain, and to expand on these issues that were going on. But there are many more changes, and if you ask me, they are really big changes and surprising changes. So I wanted to explore those and focus on those differences between the written text and the movie. We're going to start with some details, and we're going to move progressively towards the more important changes. So one detail, okay, look out for Tatsuo, Tsuruko's husband, who, by the way, was played by the great filmmaker Chuso Itami. So that's very interesting how he portrayed this character. Now, when I read the novel, I did not get a sense of a despotic Tatsuo from the Makioka Sisters by Tanizaki, okay? So when I looked at the movie, I feel that the movie portrays him as much more bossy than I felt he was in the novel, okay? This is just a matter of interpretation, and I think at the end of the day, it's not really a very important change, but I think, I just wanted to mention it. A much more important change that many readers of the novel are going to find and see is that we have no Stoltzes and no Kirilenkos in the movie. Okay, this is a Japanese movie with Japanese characters. So the Western families are gone here. And because these foreign families have been excised from the story, we do not get that contrast between Japanese culture and quote unquote Western culture. Okay? So that is something that is absent in the movie. And there are also, as a result of this, much less references to world affairs and what was going on in the world. There are definitely references to the war and all that, but not as much as in the novel. Okay. Now you can ask Jorge, is that really crucial? I would say maybe not, but these are changes that are important. The characters, the Stoltz family, the Kirilenkos appear and are referred to throughout the novel, sometimes through letters, right, towards the end of the novel, but they are there. So I think it's a difference that just has to be explored. Another big change is that in the novel, Tsuruko and her family moved to Tokyo in the first part of the novel, before page 100. Okay, so this is one of the first important things that happen in the novel. In the film, the move to Tokyo is put at the very end of the film. So it's made part of the climax of the movie. And of course, once again, in itself, you could say, well, this is a detail, and maybe moving the move to Tokyo towards the end in the film responds a lot better to, cinematic language, and that is true. But still, as a result of that, in the movie, we get no Osaka-Tokyo contrast. And, that is a very important dichotomy in the novel. So that is also absent there. The ending, okay? Another very important change that we have here. So unlike the novel, the film features an explanation for Taiko's actions by Taiko herself. She's talking to one of the sisters at one point, and she says, all of those things I did, right? It was because I wanted to get your attention. Those men that I got involved with, I thought that you just cared about Yukiko and not about me. So I got involved with, Okubata and with Itakura, including the elopement and everything, just to get y'all's attention, right? So, that is problematic to me. It could be a possible explanation for the way that Taiko acted, but that was not exactly the sense that I got from the novel. And the most important problem that I had with that is that it's not really subtle at all, and I feel that it simplifies Taiko and her reasons for acting the way she did, right? So making it explicit, I feel that something is lost right there. It's like we are forced to accept an interpretation for Taiko's behavior, whereas the novel gives you room to interpret it yourself. And something super important, okay? I feel that the overall tone of the film is just very different from the tone of the novel as I experienced it, okay? The film actually features a kind of moral, and that is that sisters must stay together, okay? Sachiko says this in the film. Sisters must stay close together. That's what she says. And Tsuruko then says, speaking of Yukiko's, spoiler alert, marriage, she says, it was worth the wait, what happened. Once again, not at all the message that the novel conveys. So to kind of wrap up this thing, let's look at the main difference between the film and the novel, from my perspective at least. I would say that the Makioka Sisters as a movie is not really a bad movie, but it's just that the novel is so much bleaker than the film, than this adaptation by Kon Ichikawa. He just changed it, I would say, completely because of the ending, right? The novel, if you look at it, conveys a really, really dark view of the family. Okay, the family as a concept here is portrayed as something quite negative, not this idea of sisters must stay close together or anything like that. In the novel, really, there is no sense of reconciliation, and I would say even no sense of fulfillment. That is what makes it, a modern novel, this sort of bleak tone that it has. And then once again, just read that last sentence in the novel. I would say read that last sentence and then watch the ending of the movie, and you'll see exactly what I mean. I'm not saying by any means that the movie should end with Yukiko going to the restroom or anything like that, but, even though this is a great film, I feel that it is ultimately not true to the bleak spirit of the novel. So, really to sum up, I would say that the film is bittersweet, whereas the novel is just plain bitter, and that is part of Tanizaki's art and the way that he looked at the world. So, bottom line here. The Makioka Sisters is really one of the masterpieces of Japanese literature. I think it would be definitely in the top 10 of the most important Japanese novels ever written. The film by Kon Ichikawa is not as highly regarded in the context of film or in the context of Ichikawa's work, but I would say it is nevertheless, a beautiful and just highly enjoyable film. There are many important differences, as I said before, between the novel and the movie, but I believe that a book is a book and the film is a film. Okay, we should judge those two types of texts separately. So I would say at the end of the day, both texts, the novel and the film, succeed in what they are trying to do. And for that reason, I would say that I highly recommend both of them. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. As always, I am always hearing and happy to respond to you. So those were my 2 cents on the Makioka Sisters, the novel by Junichiro Tanizaki and the film by Kon Ichikawa. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by and have a wonderful day.